It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter tonight, Ed Deal. Some of you who were here back in 2017 will have heard a presentation he gave when the project he's reporting on tonight was 5 years old, and tonight it's 10 years old. And I'm just going to introduce him. You would think someone born in Cooper Hospital and raised in Audubon, New Jersey would be a child prodigy birder. But Ed's midlife conversion involved taking Bud Anderson's Hawk ID class in 1991. He went on to volunteer on fall migration hawk banding projects in the Goshutes Mountain, Nevada, Florida Keys, and Cape May, New Jersey, in addition to Diamond Head, Chelan Ridge, and Intiot Ridge in Washington. He volunteered on Falcon Research Group's entire 17-year study of nesting peregrine falcons in the San Juan Islands and completed his 28th year monitoring and banding nesting peregrines in the Seattle area. For the last 10 years, he has worked with a group of volunteers studying the expanding urban population of Cooper's hawks in Seattle. He holds a federal Master Raptor banding permit. He's a graduate of the Seattle Audubon Master Birder Program and describes himself as a recovering lister. It's my pleasure to turn the screen over to Ed Deal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Please go ahead. Share your screen.
Thank you, Vicki, for that introduction. Yay!
Well, good job.
Okay. We pay homage to Robin Ricks, who designed this logo for us. Okay. So this is mostly a happy tale. Cooper's hawks are thriving in the city. There are 3 short, depressing sections of this talk, and I will identify them as we get to them. And I'll also try and advance instead of go backwards. So introduction, you already heard my background, so I can gloss through that. So Arthur Cleveland Bent had nothing nice to say about the Cooper's hawk in 1937. They just don't write like this anymore. If the Sharpshin is a bloodthirsty villain, this larger edition of feathered ferocity is a worse villain, for its greater size and strength enable it to do more damage. It is the chicken hawk, so cordially hated by poultry farmers, and is the principal cause of the widespread antipathy toward hawks in general. Widespread distribution in North America, all of the United States, lower 48 and down well into Central America for migration in the winter. So this will help you win some bird trivia questions. It's the middle size of the 3 accipiters, which you may not know it was named in 1828 by French naturalist Charles Lucien Bonaparte, who was Napoleon's nephew. This is the Bonaparte of Bonaparte's skull. He had an estate in New Jersey, and he shot a Cooper's hawk near Bordentown, New Jersey, and named it after William Cooper, a founder of the New York Academy of Sciences. Bonaparte also named Wilson's storm petrel after Alexander Wilson, and he coined the genus Zenaida for the mourning dove and white-winged dove, and Zenaida was his wife. So here are the other 2 accipiters, a juvenile male Sharpshin, 98 grams of fury, and a juvenile male northern goshawk, 700 grams of fury. And in between the 2 is a juvenile male Cooper's hawk. This one happens to be Cape May, New Jersey, and a lot of the Cooper's hawks that come through the East Coast are fairly pale. And here's the same bird from the back, almost blonde in the head as a juvenile, and our much darker northwest coast. This is in Seattle. So those of you who have read Pete Dunn's many writings know he has his tongue firmly planted in his cheek on a lot of things he writes. So this is one that's in the first edition of Hawks in Flight. And I'll give you a second to read through it. But exhibitor ID really is not easy. The most sobering reference was a study done at Golden Gate Raptor Observatory. And there's the reference for you. They tested the ID skills of their experienced counters that would watch the hawks flying south through Golden Gate and ID them. They also trap and band, and they would release banded accipiters out of sight of the counters, which included 940 juveniles. And these are experienced hawk watchers, and 23% of the male Cooper's hawks were misidentified as female Sharpies. So if the experienced hawk watchers can't get it right, what chance do the rest of us have? And if it wasn't tough enough already, you get something like this. This was trapped in the Appalachians in North Carolina, I believe in 2008 by our old friends, Kathy Gunther and Mark Hopi at the Big Bald Bird Observatory. It's a hybrid Cooper's hawk, goshawk. It should not be brown here. Goshawk would be silver gray. And it's an old bird based on the dark eye color. So accipiters are a problem for identification. So urban nesting Cooper's hawks, the colonization of the city started in the 1980s and 1990s. It took them a long while to get over being shot for 300 years as chicken hawks, but they overcame some of their fear of humans and started moving into the city. Now, I'm often asked, well, weren't they always here and you're just getting better at finding them? But the best argument for this is a new phenomena was documented in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where biologists were driving structured surveys looking for nesting redtails and great horned owls. And for the first 5 years, they had no Cooper's hawk nests. And they tracked the annual growth up to 40 nests. And I believe they're up in the 50s or 60s now. So what's going on? They're adapting to human altered landscapes along with several other raptors that are adapting to human landscapes. And John Marsloff's book is wonderful. If anybody hasn't read it, it's a really convincing argument on why some birds adapt to and some birds avoid human altered landscapes. Europe has two accipiters, the sparrowhawk, and they also have a goshawk. And in Europe, it's the goshawks, Europe and Japan. Actually, the goshawks are colonizing cities. There's over 100 nesting pairs of goshawks in Berlin, about the same in Hamburg, Germany. So here is a juvenile female goshawk in Lake Forest Park. This was, I believe, 4 years ago. A window hit. This bird is really stunned because I don't recommend holding a goshawk in a baby cradle because you could end up severely punctured. Also, sharpshins are exceedingly rare. This photograph was from 2013. This was a nest about 2 miles north of the Seattle city limits. And one reason why sharpshins are not nesting in the city is that they are on the menu. So here's a photo I was sent from Edmonds a few years ago of an adult Cooper's hawk killing a juvenile sharpshin, complete with blood spurt. So the Seattle study started by Jack Bettesworth in 2003, 2004. It's all volunteer, self-funded. The other long-term urban Cooper's hawk studies, the Victoria, BC has been ended. Andy Stewart retired. Tucson is a question mark now because Bill Mannon is a professor at University of Arizona, and he's retiring, and they're not sure whether they're going to continue that study. But certainly Bob Rosenfield in Wisconsin and Brian Millsap and Kristen Madden's group in Albuquerque is doing great work. Here's your typical urban Cooper's hawk, recently fledged juvenile on Capitol Hill, standing on somebody's canopy of their car. And they make very nice hood ornaments. So we'll take a quick run through the annual cycle and then finish up with the results of our study. So as with most birds, they run through these series of events. So courtship and nest building. Courtship goes on for several weeks, if not longer. They often build more than one nest. Both members help build the nest. If you want to find courting Cooper's hawks, you got to get out of bed. Dawn vocalization is the best way to find them. And you really got to work hard before the deciduous trees leaf out. One year we logged 601 site visits before May 1st. Oh, get some music. So I did a study in 2015 on dawn survey effectiveness. If I went out 30 minutes before, in the hour, 30 minutes before and after sunrise, my success rate was 71% of detecting Cooper's hawks. If I went out after that time, 27%. Also, 50 of the 70 detections were heard the calls first. So noise pollution in the city can really impact your ability to find Cooper's hawks. So typical spring survey, we'd find a stick nest. Is it a crow or a Cooper's hawk? Not sure, but later in the year, they fledged 5 out of that nest. Another typical Cooper's hawk nest in a big leaf maple in Columbia City. City Park, way up in a Madrona. They typically, Cooper's hawk nests typically are on the center trunk about 15 or 20 feet down from the crown. But then some Cooper's hawks don't read the book. And this is a low lateral branch in a cottonwood. And just to prove it wasn't a fluke, they used the same nest 2 years in a row. And sometimes you get a nice hint that it's a Cooper's hawk nest instead of a crow because the Cooper's hawk is still there. So this is what you're looking for in spring. Male Cooper's hawk, female Cooper's hawk, just sitting in the sun before the trees have leafed out. And they might sit there for half an hour and then launch into some courtship activities of mating and nest building, and they'll reveal where their nest is. And here's another pair of Cooper's hawks in a woodlot by Carkeek Park. So you're standing there, it's cold, it's early morning, you'd rather be at the espresso bar with some coffee, and you glance away for a second and you get woofed. So this vocabulary word came from Bud Anderson, referring to peregrines. If you take your eye off a peregrine that's perched, it will vanish without a trace. So Cooper's hawks, I call them the ninja assassins of the hawk world. They're the most common hawk in our city and probably the least seen because they make a living by not being seen. Perch and scan, ambush, quick pursuit hunting specialists. Here's an adult male Cooper's hawk, and both sexes will flare out their undertail coverts during courtship. And the best field mark for him being a male is this purple band on his left leg. So as with most raptors, it's reverse sexual dimorphism where the females are much bigger than the males. The pairs are monogamous, but they often cheat. So here's a typical adult pair, and size is your first clue. The female is so much bigger than the male. Another field mark that works very well with adults is the males have gray behind the eye and the females have buffy. And that works about 90% of the time. Another field mark that I'm just experimenting with, females barring in the front is coarse and males is fine. But that's a tough one. It's much, I think the cheek color and side, if you get them perched side by side, it's a no-brainer. And if food is delivered and the behaviors are correct, mating occurs, and right after mating, they launch into nest building. So here's an ambitious 1-year-old female Cooperswalk nest building. And here's a adult female nest building. And they'll get in there and rearrange and lay down and check the fit of the bowl and spin a little bit side to side because they're going to have to lay there for 5 weeks. So egg laying, mid-April. Actually, it started about April 10th this year. April 9th was our first incubation date. But long before that, the female stops hunting. She stays near the nest area, usually. She'll lay 4 or 5 eggs, 2 to 3 days apart. The mischief comes because each egg has to be individually fertilized. So there's a potential for extra pair copulations. Both birds contribute to incubation. 5 weeks, the male does all the hunting, and early failures may re-nest. We've had 3 nests collapse during incubation, and 2 of the 3 moved to another nest and relayed and fledged successfully. The 3rd one did not relay. So here's the world record Cooperswalk clutch, 8 young in a nest. Bob Rosenfield is a Cooperswalk expert in Wisconsin. Most of the Cooperswalks love these jack pines to nest in, and they're easily climbed. So they climb up and band the young, and in some cases take DNA samples. In this case, they did take blood samples from all 8 and determined that they were all related, one clutch. This wasn't 2 different females, each laying a clutch of 4. So Bob Rosenfield also did a brilliant study we published in 2015. They climbed the trees and took the blood samples from 140 chicks, and then they trapped the parents and took blood samples from the parents and tried to match them. Well, 19.3% of the young were fathered by somebody else. So 1/3 of the nests had at least 1 extra pair young. 1 territorial male sired all the young in his nest, and 1 another couple kilometers away. 2 nests, the territorial male didn't even sire any of the young he raised. So what's going on is you'd think that while the male's off hunting, he'll make a slight detour and drop off a house sparrow at the neighboring female and leave behind some DNA. So we looked at Brian Millsap's study. This is from 2013. And this is a telemetry study of 6 male Cooperswalk territories, 7 male Cooperswalk territories. And the hatched area is the movements of 1 female prior to incubation. So she's checking out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different male territories. So Brian, who's a great Cooperswalk researcher, these are mostly telemetry points. There weren't visual sightings, but it's Yagi antenna and triangulation and marking them in a dense commercial pine forest. So Brian hypothesized that the females assessing the neighboring males and their territories. Well, then Jack Bettesworth had a incident or a set of observations in his files that we went back through and realized what we were seeing after Bob Rosenfield published his DNA results, and we looked at Brian Millsap's map of female movements prior to egg laying. So Jack and his Murray band of volunteers observed a banded female who, by the way, was from Victoria, BC and had a red band. She was courting two neighboring males at the same time, one in the Arboretum and one in Volunteer Park. And they staked out both nest areas with a group of volunteers. And they had 15 days where they observed copulations with both males. The female mated with the male in the Arboretum the day before she went to incubation in Volunteer Park. And Martin and I had a banded female going back and forth between two males, and then picked one of them, and then the other male pulled in a new female, and they both fledged 4 young. So Bob Rosenfield felt that these females are trying to get extra feedings as well as genetic diversity of their offspring, but extra feedings to help with high energy demands of egg formation. The eggs are about 9% body weight, and they lay 4 or 5 of them over 10 days. So it's a huge energy demand. And just before they lay an egg, they go into what we call egg lethargy. They'll just sit here on the edge of the nest like they're hypnotized. And I interpret it as they're just marshaling all their energy to form an egg. And once you see the tail immobile for a while, you know incubation has started. Hatching is asynchronous. They hatch in the order laid, and hatching will start late this month. And it's incredibly fast growth. They go from an egg to an adult in 5 weeks. And here we usually have 3 or 4 young in a successful nest, but occasionally 5. And the male continues to hunt for everyone. So here's a 1-week-old nest, 4 chicks. And this is in a madrona tree. So mom has brought in some cedar sprigs for insecticide or deodorant purposes. And then 3 days later, the oldest chick is as big as the other 3. As the young get bigger, the female sits higher in the nest when she's brooding them, and it's more obvious to see. And at some point, they're just too big to brood, and she just sits in the nest with them to stand guard. They're all still relying on the male to feed them. And they get at some point so big and obnoxious that the female leaves, and she'll perch just out of sight of the young, but close enough that she can still stand guard. So here's 4 young here. And it can get fairly crowded in that nest as well. So about 4 weeks old, they'll start branching, and they'll fledge at 5 weeks. So end of June through mid-August, they continue to be dependent on their parents for food. Something clicks in their head about 2 weeks after fledging, and they start chasing everything, prey, each other, inappropriate things like great blue herons. And the adult male continues to do all the hunting. Some females will start hunting as well, or they'll just leave and let the male finish the job. So here's a teenage hoodlum gang of fledged Cooperswalks. They're very curious and exploring their habitat. They're all, at least in Seattle, there's enough food for everybody, so there's not real any competition. So they have a lot of time on their hands to go out and explore. Here's your velociraptor. And these two girls are taking turns bumping the other one off the top of this cedar. How do I know they're girls? They both have orange bands on their right legs. Best field mark for that. And even though they're out of the nest and fledged for several weeks, they'll still lie down horizontally like they're still in the nest, and they'll find a nice branch and snooze like this. So University of Arizona did a great telemetry study on juvenile dispersal. In their study of 40, 5 to 7 weeks post-fledging, the young have mastered hunting to some extent and they leave. Females disperse further than males, but neither disperse very far. Siblings disperse independently, and a third are dead within 6 months. So here's one of my favorite photos that was sent to me. This male fledged out of Roanoke Park in North Capitol Hill. And right at 6 weeks, he turned up at Edmonds in a backyard in the rain, and he is going somewhere. And we don't know where because his band hasn't been sighted again. But this is just walking on a fence in a backyard, and the homeowner took a great photo. So at about 2 years old, they'll nest for the first time, although some and perhaps all females will nest when they're 1 year old, still in juvenile plumage. Males are extremely rare to nest at 1 year old. So a high percentage of 1 year old females in the nesting population is said to be indicative of a rapidly expanding population or high adult mortality, making room for 1 year olds. So these are 1 year old breeding females. Almost 25% of our breeding females are in juvenile plumage. Brian Millsap gave me 2 years of his data, roughly the same number. And Bill Stout in Milwaukee, again, a fairly high percentage of 1 year old females. So again, an adult male, second year female, 1 year old, still in juvenile plumage with a pale orange eye. So then Brian Millsap, who admirably went back to college in his late 50s, early 60s and got his PhD on Cooper's hawks. And he did a great study, put transmitters on 80 juvenile females over 4 years. 60% are dead in the first year. If they live through the first year, 100% of the survivors nested while still in juvenile plumage. That's not quite true. One of the birds was injured and in rehab and didn't nest. But if you contrast that to 1 year old males, Bob Rosenfield's huge data set, 13 1 year old males out of 732 nesting pairs. And here in Seattle, we've had 19 1 year old males still in juvenile plumage out of 330 pairs. And it's thought it takes the males longer to become proficient hunters and to find and hold a good breeding territory, because he's got to hunt for himself, his mate, and 4 or 5 kids. And most first year 1 year old males can't handle that. So what are they eating? Mostly things you want eaten. Starlings, house sparrows, pigeons, rats, rabbits. They'll also take whatever's common and easy to catch. A good study done in Victoria, 50% of the prey base was starling and house sparrows. If you throw in robins, you got 85% of what they're eating, and the other 15% is everything. So they The Cooperswalks are attracted to these industrial strength feeder operations in the city. And you'd think that they would selectively hunt the feeders, but Tim Roth did a study in Terre Haute, Indiana, radio tracked wintering exhibitors, both Sharpies and Coops, and his data set said no systematic use of bird feeders. They visited bird feeders no more frequently than other portions of the habitat. And I love this quote: feeders are locations where humans are more likely to observe hawk attacks, not where hawks are most likely to hunt. Still, I'd love to duplicate, either me or somebody in the US, duplicate this study and see if that holds true. Here was my dear departed favorite male. He's passed on. He fledged 17 young over 4 years. And he's down on, here's a 280 gram Coop with a 350 gram pigeon. And he's glaring at the photographer because he knows the pigeon is too heavy for him to pick up and fly off. So he wants the photographer to back off, and he'll dress the bird so it's a little lighter, and then he'll lumber back to his family. This is a very ambitious juvenile female with a rabbit, but just for a few weeks after they fledge, they have this really lovely buffy color in their throat. And that, I'm suspicious whether this bird caught the rabbit or the parents brought it in and she's just mantling it so that her siblings don't steal it. So I think dietary flexibility is one of the keys to the success of urban Cooper's hawks. Up here, it's a mix of birds, rats, and rabbits. Down in the Southwest, there's all those dove species we don't have here. Yeah. Inca dove. In Wisconsin, it's lots of chipmunks. And there was an early study done in the 80s on Lopez Island, Washington, where their favorite prey was California quail. So they do eat rabbits in Seattle. And this is a Drake wood duck kill near the Arboretum. So first depressing subject, downside of urban living, collisions with windows, power lines, cars. Trichomonas is a protozoan carried by pigeons. We've had several peregrines die from Trichomonas. Anticoagulants and other rat poisons. Rat poison kills more than rats. And Cooperswalks do have predators like raccoons, the big owls, the eagles, red-tailed hawks, peregrines, and egg thieves, crows, squirrels, and jays. So here's a freshly dead window hit. And the homeowner was just so sad about this because he'd been watching the nest in his backyard. And this bird still has a crop from his last meal. And here's the Cooper's hawk eating a rat. So anticoagulants, the first generation were blood thinners developed in the 1940s. Your next trivial pursuit, warfarin was the first of the blood thinners, and Wisconsin Alumni Research Fund is where the name warfarin came from. Rats started to develop immunity to this. So second generation anticoagulants were developed in the 1970s called super warfarins, the nastiest of which is brodifacoum. The half-life of brodifacoum in a rat liver is 305 days. So it really sticks around. It's a slow-acting, highly lethal, and highly persistent poison. So California, as in many things, good and bad, leads the country. And they did some testing on different raptors. And most of the raptors they tested had been exposed to anticoagulant rat poisons. They also tested a lot of mammals. Probably the most depressing thing is 28 out of 28 mountain lions were positive. There's some more recent study that say turkey vultures and California condors are also exposed. The anticoagulants are also linked to fatal cases of mange in cats and immune suppression in bobcats. So we saw all this and said, well, what's been done in Washington, which is basically nothing. So in order to get grants to do some research, we formed Urban Raptor Conservancy, and we being Patty Leshy, Martin Muller, and myself. And we formed a 501(c) with a goal of establishing the baseline levels of rodenticide exposure in Western Washington. And our goal now is 200 raptors, and we're getting close. We've been able to raise most of the money to do the cost of the whole study. Paws Wildlife Center is wonderful. They're our collaborator on this study. But while we're doing this, somebody did publish a study in Washington. It's a small sample, but it's part of the culling of barred owls that are shot in spotted owl territories. And they tested 14 owls from the Cle Elum area, and 9 tested positive, all at trace levels of brodifacoum. So then the first part of our study, the data shows that most of the birds are exposed, testing positive for at least one anticoagulant rodenticide. 34 or 38 of our Cooperswalks tested positive for from 1 to 4 different anticoagulant rodenticides. And this is a topic for a whole lecture, is exposed versus poison. What's a safe level of exposure? That lecture is for another day. We hope to get this data published later this year. We really want to express our thanks to Patagonia for several grants, and the Peter Mason Family Charitable Trust for several grants. Seattle Audubon has been wonderful. Connie Sightings, as you know, is a force of nature, and 200 individual donors. The second part of our study is underway. PAWS had to get some additional permitting to test bald eagles. And we had decided not to test peregrines because, hey, they just eat other birds. They're not going to be eating rodents. But our friends to the north in Vancouver, BC, have tested several peregrines, and they've been positive. We also added testing for a substitute for anticoagulants for the neurotoxin bromethylin. And tune in later this year for the results. So that's the end of the first part of the talk, and now we'll get into the Cooperswalk study results. So we had 3 big goals. We wanted to find all the nests in the city and measure density, verify the number of fledglings to measure productivity of successful nests, and put color ID bands on as many adults and fledglings to look at a number of different data points. So last year, we had 69 nest building pairs, actually 70. We just found a nest and the property owner said, oh yeah, they were here last year too. So the city of Seattle is 84 square miles. So the minimum density, about 1 pair for every 1.2 square miles. But we've had 2 nests 330 meters apart. In some areas, you just can't search, like the old, the jungle in the Greenbelt along Beacon Hill over I-5, between the road noise and the safety issues. I'm not going in there. So last year, where did they nest? They love the Seattle Park system. Thank you, Seattle Parks. Private residences, cemeteries, the state of Washington, that's the Montlake Phil, and on a National Guard base down by Boeing Field. And all of these red circles are Cooperswalk nests, and 12 of the 14 of the circles are part of the Olmsted Brothers plan for Seattle parks. It's a wonderful plan. It didn't get completely realized, but what they did is wonderful. One of the goals was to have a city park within a mile of every person. And so you go down here, there's the Arboretum and Lakeview Park and Madrona Park and Frink Park, and then Coleman, on and on. So it's a great park system, and the Cooperswalks approve. They have a range of nest habits, like dense forest. There's a Cooperswalk nest here in third growth Doug fir. Those are really tough because they're just about invisible. Mixed habitat, here's the Arboretum. There's an entrance to the Japanese garden right there, and they were in this maple right over the parking lot. On the UW campus, they were right over the parking lot here. Here's the entrance on 17th, and the old Burke Museum is right there. Another city park. And private yards. Most of the private yards are north and northwest and northeast, where the remnant second growth Doug fir has been somewhat left in place. So every city block will have little clusters of Doug firs and cedars and some big leaf maple. So again, here's a nest in a big leaf maple. There's another one in a big leaf maple in northeast Seattle. So what trees will they nest in? Anything they want. Big leaf maple and Doug fir are their perennial favorites, but you can run down the list, including eucalyptus, tulip, horse chestnut, Oregon ash, on and on and on. The 10-year data on this is pretty similar. So nest territory fidelity, birds will, about 80% of the returning birds will build a new nest every year. And about 20% will reuse the same nest. So a typical year from 2015 to 2016, 78% of the territories were reoccupied, 80%, 81% built a new nest, and the rest reused the previous year. We had one banded female who used the same nest for 9 years, fledged 37 young, and she was courting for a 10th year in the same nest and was hit by a car and killed. So productivity, if we have a successful nest, we're getting almost 3.6 young fledged per pair. Adult females putting out 3.73 young per successful nest, and 1-year-olds females in juvenile plumage paired with an adult male, 3.42. So there's a slight difference, but not much. So typical, this is not a typical year. This is last year. We started with 69 nest building pairs. 8 of them vanished or died. And we ended up with 61 that progressed to incubation. 57 hatched, so 4 sites, something happened during incubation. 1 was a nest collapse. So you got hatched young in the nest. 5 of them still fail for whatever reason. 52 pairs fledged young. We got 192 fledglings last year. So again, 3.69 fledged per successful pair. So here's our 10-year data set on successful pairs, successful nests, and you can see where the trend is going in Seattle. The first year Martin and I took over the study from Jack, we had 68 fledged, and last year we had 192. The third phase of the study is to put color ID bands. The Federal Bird Banding Lab gives us silver bands which you can only read if you have the bird in the hand, i.e. injured badly or dead. But if you put these color ID bands on, you can read them with a good spotting scope, but you have to buy them yourself, and they're anywhere from $10 to $20 a piece. So we use Balsha tree traps. We use non-native lures. This is a society finch and a house sparrow, and a very curious juvenile male Cooperswalk who just can't understand why these birds won't fly away so he can chase them. So if we do catch one, males get a purple band on their left leg. This one would be read purple left 0/8. And females get an orange band on the right leg. This would be orange right 6/R. And here's our second depressing topic, not Patty, but good old, was he 3/1, 1/3. One bad thing is the purple bands fade to pink in the sun. So he was doing great. He nested on the UW campus for several years. And while his hen was on eggs, he was hunting up in UW frat row, and he hit a window and had to be euthanized at pause. We tested him and he was positive for 4 different anticoagulants. So I took and drew a 500-meter circle around his nest and searched the area, which included about 1/3 of the UW campus, the University Way Business District, and Frat Row. I found 298 rat poison bait boxes. So it's no wonder that all these birds are exposed. And Martin Muller gets to release a banded Cooperswalk who's all too happy to leave. So for the first 9 years, Martin and I were the banders. And then we added 2 new banders. We banded 436 coops. We've had 194 of them seen again, which would be 44%, which is an excellent return rate. We're up to 570 just in the last few days. Mortality is still a problem, especially window hits. But most of our sightings are live sightings, and people will read the band or photograph it. It's amazing with the proliferation of good cameras. Also, the thing that was wonderful for us, but not so wonderful for everybody else, was COVID. People working from home, and they've got their laptop at the dining room table, but they're really looking out the window at the bird feeder. And in comes the Cooperswalk, and they pick up their camera and send us a picture of a banded Cooperswalk. So it's been great for us. We got 164 sightings last year. So where are these band sightings? Mostly in Seattle. And if you add King County, there's 520 of our 563 is just King County. Island County has a high number, mainly because there's been a male going to the same person's backyard bird feeder for 6 years. And he shows up a couple of times a month to work the feeders. We just had our first Mason County referral just after I updated this slide. And we had one from Oakland, California. And this year we got one from Nye County, Nevada. She almost made it to Vegas, baby. So we have had, out of these 563 band sightings, 2 south of Tacoma. So do they migrate? 2 did, but most of them stay home because it's too easy to live in Seattle. So most urban Cooperswalks don't migrate. They have strong site fidelity, both to nesting and wintering. And when they disperse after fledging, they don't go very far. So Jack Bettisworth was the sole bander in the original part of this study. He banded 269 birds with blue bands. The last known surviving blue band is Old Blue, And he was born in spring of 2010 and banded early in 2011. And he has nested, let's see if I can get this to advance. He has nested successfully for 11 straight years, including his first year when he was still in juvenile plumage, and he's fledged 41 young. So I want to put in a thank you to Jeff Graham and Larry Gilpin for busting their butts to try and get this photo for Jack to see Old Blue. And last year, Will and Driscoll and Inga Watson did the same thing. They didn't get the band code, but they got the blue band, and we know he's the only blue band bird left, and he's been in the same city park all 11 years, but a different nest almost every year. And he is there right now, hopefully with his female on eggs, so he can add to this total. The record lifespan for a Cooper's hawk is 20 years. So he's got some upside to go here. But the average lifespan is 6. So people with good cameras, this was sent to me. Woman sees this out her window and kitchen window and takes a picture. This is a great story. I banded this bird about 8 hours earlier, and she turned up about 200 meters away in a water feature. And the house resident nicely took this picture. A few months later, she blundered into Bud Anderson's array of traps that ring SeaTac Airport to keep the hawks away from the airplanes. And when the hawks are trapped at SeaTac, they get a one-way trip and a band, if they're not already banded, up to Bud's place and are released on the Skagit Flats. So I forgot all about her code. And 2 years later, I got sent this picture from Anacortes. And I'm like, wow, a Seattle bird in Anacortes, that's great. And then I looked her up and realized that she had had a little help getting to Anacortes because she'd been released on the Skagit. But she nested in Anacortes for a couple of years. And there's no doubt who she is from this photo. So still some great research questions. What will be the ultimate urban nesting density? We're seeing a lot of turnover replacements in birds this spring. And I saw a really nasty fight between two Cooper's hawks. So we might be getting close to that, but tune in again in 2030 for the next update. How do Cooper's hawks and barred owls partition the habitat? Not well. Some of them will tolerate each other. We've had 2 pairs of Cooper's hawks forced out of their territory by barred owls who took over that territory, and the Cooper's hawks moved out into a much less densely wooded area and nested. And the last of 3 depressing subjects is how will climate change affect urban raptors? So we did not even know there was a nest in South Cheesty Mountain View last year until these 3 dead Cooper's hawk chicks jumped out of the nest from being too hot from the 100-degree heat in late June. That heat wave hit at the worst possible time when everybody was nestling, were small nestlings. So these guys have no adult flight feathers at all, so they fly like a rock. And they were found and reported. One chick didn't jump and lived to fledge. So we had a panic at Paws Wildlife Center. They had a full house, 12 Cooper's hawks that were jumpers, 9 bald eagles, 2 merlins, a sharpshin. And the good news about this is before we released them, or Paws released them, we got to band them. A number of volunteers went out and made sure that the parents were still there so that you're releasing a bird back to somebody who's going to continue to feed it. They had to stay in captivity long enough to learn how to fly and then be released. And while we thought we got slammed by that heat wave, so last year, late June, we had 3 days, 102, 104, and 108. Portland had a peak temperature of 116. And Portland Audubon operates a wildlife care center. They admitted 110 Cooperswalk chicks in 4 days. And they were able to re-nest at least 2/3 of those. Most of them would just be rehydrated and returned to their parents once it cooled down. So how are we doing this year so far? As of yesterday, we have 13 incubating. We have 40 active sites. And what's very odd, we have a high number of sites that were active last year that aren't active at all, 21. So don't know what's going on. Tune in again for the next update in 5 years and maybe we'll find out. So if you want to know more about Coopershawks, Bob Rosenfield is Mr. Coopershawk. It's a great book. Another great book is Urban Raptors. Has a nice chapter on Coopershawks. I didn't help write it, but I am a co-author on the Peregrine chapter in this book. So the perks of urban fieldwork: pick your study area wisely. We stay nicely caffeinated in Seattle on our Coopershawk searches. And in 2018, I did a big year. And after I'm spending 8 hours looking for Coopershawks, I went to every brew pub in Seattle, all 56 of them that year. And I'm glad I did it then because we're up to 75 or so now. I want to give my thanks to the Coop group, some of our volunteers past and present, and a few people who have donated photographs. Thanks to all. And if you're ever short on a clothespin, a Coopershawk is happy to help out if you've got a bird feeder handy. So with that, we'll take questions.
Bravo, bravo.
Thank you, Elaine.
Ed, that was fascinating. I kept writing questions and then you promptly answered them. So but I do have one question. Is there any training for the chicks about how to find their own food, or are they relying on what nature has built into them?
Yeah, it's pretty much built in. Like I said, when they first fledge, they don't have a clue. You know, food comes from mom and dad. And in about 2 to 3 weeks, something clicks in their development and they start chasing. And I actually saw a Coopershawk chasing, a fledgling Coopershawk chasing a thrush. I think it was, I forget what species it was, but it was making the food begging call while it's chasing the thrush. So it didn't quite have hunting figured out yet. But they'll experiment with chasing and hunting and chasing each other. And I think it's really hardwired.
Well, I wish they would come visit Magnuson Park's community garden more often. We have an abundance of rabbits.
Well, that's the densest population of Coopershawks in the city too. There's 4 nests in Magnuson.
Wow.
So they'll be there.
Wonderful.
Other questions?
Well, Ed, we have a number of questions, and Clever Me put the first one in, if I may. That extraordinary Coopershawk goshawk hybrid. Are they recognized with any frequency? Was that just a amazing opportunity because the bird was in hand? But do you think that hybridization?
There was a juvenile hybrid trapped a few years ago at Cape May, New Jersey, at the fall hawk migration trapping program, and DNA tested and everything, and it definitely was a goshawk Coopershawk hybrid.
Our friend Damadina has a trifecta of questions, if I may start with.
Okay.
Any guesses on why the size of a female Coopershawk is 1.7 times the size of the male? Is so much more than other raptor species?
No, I don't.
All right,
I'll
Strike
take a pass
one.
on, I'll take a pass on that one.
all right. Okay, here's strike, your second pitch. Between the male and female, who decides the placement of the nest? For peregrines, let's see, peregrines are bonded, so to speak, with the nest. To what degree is that true for Cooper's hawks?
It tends to be the female, in my experience.
Right. Oh, tell us about
last
the
year-
girl. Sorry.
Last year in one city park, I had the female hauling sticks to one nest and the male simultaneously hauling sticks to a second nest. And I just shook my head at him and said, you know, and that indeed they ended up in the nest she built.
Speaking of which, could we take a moment to genuflect to the Queen? Could you tell us the story?
Oh, the Queen of Seattle. This was the female who used the same nest for 9 years straight and was about to nest for the 10th year using the same nest. And it's still there. The nest is huge. And she's been gone for 3 or 4 years. She fledged 37 young out of the same nest with a succession of different males before she was hit by a car up on California Avenue in West Seattle.
Well, we remember her fondly, those of us who had a chance to see her.
Yeah, she was also banded by Jack, part
Oh,
of his program. Yeah.
well, that's a wonderful story.
Do I
Damadina's
get
third question.
Do I get
Can
a
you-
third strike?
Yes, can you comment on the phenomenon of second-year females displacing adult females during that period? Damadina says she's surprised that younger birds could show an advantage over an adult bird.
I don't know what's going on there, but we're seeing a lot of it, of juvenile females displacing adult females. I just emailed that question to Bob Rosenfield in Wisconsin this evening earlier. So we'll see what he has to say about that.
All right.
I'm baffled personally, because the book says the adult females should be dominant over the 1-year-old juvenile females. But that's not seemingly what we're seeing in several events. We've had 9 individual birds already displaced this year. And I think there's some more. I'm still going through my data pile.
Growing up in heat made them into super women. Well, all right. Josh and Monica DeSilvi have asked, with Cooper's hawks breeding and living in our cities, have you seen evidence of them expanding their diet to include human food waste or garbage?
No, I have not. But I've seen a lot of rats carried into the nest or being eaten, and some bunnies.
Right. Another one that's timely for winter, is the site different from the nest site? I guess the roost site, is it different from the nest site?
It can be sometimes. We had another one of Jack's blue banded birds who nested for 9 or 10 years up by Sandpoint Golf Course and was regularly photographed in winter in Magnuson Park. So he would just glide down the hill 3/4 of a mile and winter in Magnuson.
Here's a very good question. And I want to remind folks, if you don't see on the screen right now, is a sheet for the Urban Raptor Conservancy overall with the various projects that are underway. And at the bottom, how you can support Urban Raptor Conservancy. I failed to put down how you can report sightings. Ed, would you tell people how they can report sightings?
Go to our website.
Yeah, basically, if you could get a photo that shows the band, it's really, really helpful. And then there is a place where you can enter your information, where you saw the bird, and submit the photograph. And these are all great pieces of a puzzle.
Yes, thank you.
Penny Bolton
Oh,
wants to know, how are ravens who've moved into the Arboretum, affecting the,
Barred owl.
that's not the right 4-letter code for barred owl, but we'll let that go. Barred owl and Cooper's hawk. It's BADO, my dear Penny. That's all right. Politics, ravens, politics, barred owls, and Cooper's.
Right. I haven't kept good track of what's happening with ravens, but they're definitely expanding. They started in Lincoln Park, and then 2 years ago we had ravens nesting in an old Cooper's hawk nest in Westcrest Park,
Because there's
about 75 yards from the Cooper's hawk nest. And Mrs. Cooper's hawk was not happy at all with her neighbors. So there was a lot of yelling and screaming and chasing, especially when the young fledged. And I've seen the male at Lincoln Park go frantically, angrily chasing after a raven several times. So that, but I haven't seen any evidence of predation by the ravens, although they're very proficient nest predators.
Gretchen has mentioned something which actually brings up another kind of question. Gretchen says she photographed a pair at the Good Shepherd Center Friday.
Yes.
That's where the eucalyptus tree is, isn't it?
Yes.
And she wrote that one silver band is visible. And my question to add to her observation is, well, we could be getting federally banded Cooper's hawks that you all have not banded. And where would be the
we could, but that bird is double banded. It's the
Okay.
male.
It just wasn't visible, the other color band.
So yeah, that's a good point, because we have the permit to put the color bands on, and other people don't choose to do that. Like all the birds at SeaTac that get banded just get a silver federal band.
Right.
We've had at least 2 of them get trapped at SeaTac, released up on the Skagit, and they find their way back to Seattle.
Well, your girl that you showed, who then was adopted by Bud, she didn't have a wing tag when you showed that second one. You think it fell off?
No, they don't put the wing tags on Cooper's hawks.
I see.
They only put the patagial tags on red-tailed hawks.
Oh, okay. That's got it. And so the closest area for banding of Cooper's hawks that you can imagine would be from Bud in the airport.
Yeah. And they're released up on the Skagit.
Right.
Yeah, other than that, it's Chelan Ridge Hawkwatch site in fall migrants.
Oh, that's a long way.
Yeah.
Nat Geo is asking about banding. How do you determine sex of a nestling fledgling when you're banding out of the nest?
And tarsus width and wing length and weight will all help
And
you
weight.
separate. There's no overlap between males and females, so you can separate them out.
Isn't that great?
But we have a measuring gauge for their leg size, and no matter what, you always put the size that the leg gauge says on it.
Fabulous. Anyone else with questions, you're welcome to either type them in, or you can actually unmute yourself and speak to the man. Up in the left corner of this slide now is a photo of Jack. Anyone
Yeah,
else?
Jack is a brilliant field biologist. He still helps out with the project. He has a half a dozen sites in Queen Anne and Magnolia that he follows meticulously. He's just great. Can't say enough good things about Jack. The only bad thing I could say is he suckered Martin and I into taking over the project from him.
Excellent.
Yeah. Hey, I have a question. I'm just wondering for Urban Raptor Conservancy, like what the future looks like for incorporating some of the more like random raptors that have shown up, like the long-eared owl that was found that had died in Mary Moore, and then some other oddities that have shown up. Like, are you guys tracking those as to mortality, or are you mostly focused on the Cooper hawk urban populations?
Yeah, the Cooperswalk peregrines, and we're helping with the Merlin study as well. And that kind of keeps our plate overflowing.
Well, if no one else has any questions for Jack, I mean, it was such a rich talk and we all learned so much. Thank you so much for sharing all the work that you and your group have done and what you've learned and what you will learn in the future. And I appreciate everyone's joining us tonight and hope that you have a wonderful spring. This is our last presentation of the year. Again, next month's meeting will be member photo night. And we certainly hope that you will join us for that. And we'll be back next fall in October when we resume our monthly meetings. So with that, I will say thank you so much, Ed. It was a wonderful presentation and wish everyone a good evening.
Thank you
very
Vicki.
much. Thanks for your attention. Yes.
I think we're
Hip, hip,
muted though.
hooray. No.
Oh,
Thank you, Jerry.
thank you, Elaine.